Sir, those numbers are being manipulated. The sentence sliced cleanly through the 48th floor boardroom, sharp enough to stop the clicking keyboards, the quiet whispers, even the soft hum of Manhattan traffic beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then every head slowly turned toward the far corner of the room where Maya Carter stood beside a silver coffee cart, one hand gripping a tablet against her navy blazer. She hadn't spoken once during the entire 3-hour acquisition meeting. Most people in the room barely remembered she was there. The investors from Chicago had ignored her while discussing projected earnings. The legal consultants had spoken over her when asking for fresh printouts. One executive had handed her an empty espresso cup without even looking at her face. That was the role people like Maya played inside Sinclair Global. Quiet, efficient, invisible. Edward Sinclair sat at the center of the 20-foot marble conference table, fingers resting calmly beside a fountain pen worth more than Maya's monthly rent. His silver tie reflected the pale winter sunlight stretching across the room. Around him sat 12 executives in tailored suits, all watching Maya now with the same expression. People gave a fire alarm that had suddenly started talking. Confusion first, then annoyance. Edward leaned back slowly in his leather chair. "Excuse me." His voice stayed calm, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Maya swallowed carefully. Her heart hammered so loudly she could feel it in her throat, but her eyes never left the financial slide glowing on the massive presentation screen behind him. Green arrows. Rising revenue charts. A perfect quarter. Too perfect. "The earnings data is delayed," she said quietly. "Those numbers are missing 2 quarters of losses." A few people exchanged glances. Then a short laugh escaped from the right side of the table. Daniel Mercer, senior acquisitions partner, loosened his cufflinks and smirked openly. Did the assistant just audit the merger? Several executives chuckled under their breath. Maya felt heat rise into her cheeks, but she didn't move. Outside the glass walls, snow drifted slowly across the New York skyline, soft white against steel and gray clouds. Inside, every eye in the room pressed against her like weight. Edward's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, folding his hands together, "I believe your responsibilities today involve scheduling and hospitality." The words were polite. That somehow made them colder. Maya glanced back at the screen again. The quarterly breakdown flashing across the projection had bothered her from the moment she walked in carrying coffee trays 40 minutes earlier. The percentages aligned too perfectly. Revenue growth repeated in identical patterns. Expense ratios rounded too evenly. She had seen manipulated reporting structures before during her unfinished years studying data analytics at Howard University. Back before hospital bills swallowed her savings. Back before her younger brother's therapy sessions mattered more than tuition. Most people in the room saw polished slides and billion-dollar forecasts. Maya saw missing data hiding in plain sight. Daniel leaned back in his chair with another amused smile. "Unless your assistant secretly works for the SEC, I think we're wasting valuable time." More laughter followed, louder this time. Maya tightened her grip on the tablet until her knuckles paled. Then she said the one sentence that made the entire room go still again. "Run the raw quarter files," she whispered, "and you'll see the fraud for yourselves." The laughter faded slowly, not because anyone suddenly believed Maya, but because uncertainty had begun spreading across the room like smoke under a closed door. Edward Sinclair remained perfectly still at the head of the table, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her with the cold concentration of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted. Snow drifted behind him beyond the towering glass windows, soft against the steel skyline of Manhattan, while the massive digital presentation continued glowing across the wall with its flawless numbers and polished forecasts. Maya could feel every second stretching tighter around her. Daniel Mercer leaned back with a smirk still hanging on his face, but it no longer looked quite as confident as before. "This is exactly why assistants should not sit in executive meetings," he muttered, straightening his tie. "They hear one financial podcast and suddenly think they are forensic accountants." A few people smiled weakly, though nobody laughed this time. Maya lowered her eyes briefly toward the tablet pressed against her chest. Her reflection stared back faintly from the dark screen. 27 years old. Temporary contract employee. 3 months inside Sinclair Global, and still invisible enough that half the executives called her sweetheart instead of learning her name. She remembered her mother standing for 10 hours a day behind a grocery store register in Baltimore, always telling her the same thing before school. People will decide who you are before you even open your mouth. That is why you must make sure your work speaks louder than they do. Maya learned early how to survive rooms that were never built for people like her. Howard University had been different at first. She loved the long nights in the analytics lab, the whiteboards covered in predictive models, the professors who treated numbers like language. But life changed fast after her father passed from heart failure. Tuition disappeared under hospital debt. Then came Isaiah's diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder, weekly therapy appointments, medication, rent, groceries. One semester became two. Two became dropping out entirely. By 24, Maya had traded classrooms for reception desks and spreadsheets for temporary staffing agencies. Yet she never stopped studying. Every night after work, while Isaiah slept on the fold-out couch in their small Queens apartment, Maya watched financial lectures on a cracked laptop balanced beside unpaid bills and cold coffee. Numbers still made sense to her. People rarely did. Edward finally broke the silence. "Explain it," he said flatly. Daniel blinked. "Edward, come on. We are seriously entertaining this." Edward did not even look at him. His attention remained on Maya. "You made an accusation in front of investors and legal counsel," he said calmly. "So explain exactly what you think you saw." Maya swallowed once. Her pulse hammered inside her ears, but her voice stayed controlled. "The growth pattern repeats every 2 quarters," she said quietly. "That almost never happens naturally at this scale. The expense ratios are rounded too evenly, and the acquisition liabilities disappear after quarter 2. She glanced toward the screen again. "Somebody delayed the reporting cycle to hide losses before the merger closes." Daniel let out a sharp breath through his nose. "That is speculation." "No," Maya replied softly. "It is math." The room fell silent again. Then from the far end of the conference table, the chief financial officer slowly reached for his laptop. His face had lost color. And for the first time since Maya entered the room that morning carrying coffee trays, fear began creeping into the eyes of the people who had ignored her. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers as lines of raw financial data began loading across his laptop screen. The soft clicking of keys echoed through the boardroom louder than before, sharp against the heavy silence pressing down over the table. Nobody spoke now. Even Daniel Mercer had stopped smiling. Maya remained standing near the wall beside the untouched coffee cart, her shoulders tight beneath her navy blazer. She wished she could disappear back into the quiet corner she occupied all morning, but it was too late for that now. Edward Sinclair rose slowly from his chair and walked toward the giant presentation screen glowing against the marble wall. The city skyline reflected faintly across the polished floor beneath his shoes. He looked calm from a distance, but Maya noticed the subtle tension in his jaw. Men like Edward built billion-dollar companies by controlling rooms, by controlling narratives. And right now, for the first time in years, control was slipping through his fingers. "Pull up the live reporting logs," he ordered quietly. The information technology analyst hesitated only a second before obeying. Fingers moved quickly across keyboards. New windows opened. Spreadsheets shifted. Columns of numbers crawled upward across the massive screen. Maya watched Daniel Mercer's confidence begin draining. In real time, he loosened his tie again, this time without the earlier swagger. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. "We are delaying a merger over a theory from a temp assistant." No one answered him, because now everyone could see it. Quarter 3 losses had been moved backward into archived reporting cycles. Operational debt hidden beneath deferred acquisition assets. Revenue inflated through temporary restructuring entries that vanished once the merger finalized. Small changes individually, catastrophic together. The chief financial officer slowly leaned back in his chair, pale beneath the conference lighting. "Oh my God," he whispered. The words barely reached above a breath, but in the silence they landed like falling glass. Maya lowered her eyes toward the floor for a moment. She did not feel victorious, only exhausted. The room smelled faintly of espresso and cold winter air drifting through hidden ventilation. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, soft and distant against Manhattan traffic 30 stories below. Edward stared at the financial screen without blinking. "How much exposure?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the legal director cleared his throat. If we signed under these numbers, he stopped. Tried again. Sinclair Global would inherit all unresolved debt obligations after the acquisition closed. Daniel straightened quickly. That is not proven. It is documented. The legal director replied sharply, eyes still locked on the screen. Daniel opened his mouth again, but stopped when Edward slowly turned toward him. The room went still. Maya had never seen silence feel heavy before, but now it pressed against every person in the boardroom. Edward's voice remained low, controlled, dangerous in a different way now. Did you know about this? Daniel laughed once under his breath, too quickly. Edward, come on. You think I would sabotage a $12 billion merger? Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Maya noticed something then that frightened her more than the confrontation itself. Fear was no longer aimed at her. It had shifted across the room entirely. Edward walked slowly back toward the table, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable beneath the pale conference lights. Then he stopped near Maya for the first time all morning, close enough for her to notice the faint smell of cedar cologne and black coffee, close enough for him to finally see her as more than background noise. He studied her carefully before speaking. How did you catch it? He asked quietly. Maya tightened her grip around the tablet. Because manipulated patterns repeat, she answered softly. And because invisible people learn to notice things everyone else overlooks. No one returned to their seat after that. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had shifted too far, too fast. Just 20 minutes earlier, the room had carried the polished confidence of a billion-dollar acquisition, closing ahead of schedule. Now the same executives stood frozen beneath the pale conference lights, staring at the giant financial screen like passengers watching cracks spread across airplane glass at 30,000 feet. Daniel Mercer wiped a hand across his mouth before speaking again. You are all overreacting, he said sharply. Accounting delays happen during mergers all the time. But even he no longer sounded convinced. The chief financial officer slowly turned his laptop around toward Edward Sinclair. Rows of highlighted entries filled the screen in red and yellow. Deferred liabilities, hidden debt transfers, artificial revenue inflation. The evidence was no longer theoretical. It sat there in cold numbers for everyone to see. Edward remained silent for several long seconds. Maya noticed something unsettling in his expression now. It was not anger. It was calculation. Men like Edward Sinclair did not survive Wall Street by reacting emotionally. They survived by identifying weak points before anyone else could. And right now, he was deciding whether the weak point in this room was Daniel Mercer or the entire deal itself. Snow continued drifting beyond the glass walls, coating the rooftops below in soft white while the city moved on without knowing $12 billion had nearly changed hands under false reporting. Maya shifted slightly beside the coffee cart, trying to steady her breathing. Her legs felt weak. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she still could not believe she had spoken at all. Temporary assistants did not interrupt mergers. They printed schedules. They ordered lunch. They disappeared into the background before powerful people forgot they were standing there. Yet somehow she had shattered the room with one sentence. Daniel suddenly pointed toward her. This is insane, he snapped. You are trusting a woman who serves coffee over your own executive team. The words landed hard in the silence. Several people looked away immediately. Maya felt her stomach tighten, though her face stayed calm. Edward finally turned toward Daniel fully. Careful, he said quietly. Daniel exhaled sharply. No, Edward, you should be careful. We are letting a temporary assistant derail months of negotiations because she watched a few online finance videos. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. She was used to comments like that. Comments wrapped in polished language, but carrying the same message underneath. You do not belong here. You are useful until you speak. Edward walked slowly back toward the head of the table. His shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. The problem, he said evenly, is that the assistant was right. Nobody moved. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. You cannot seriously be considering pulling the merger. Edward looked toward the legal team. Can we proceed safely under current disclosures? The senior attorney answered immediately this time. No, one word. Flat. Final. Daniel laughed once under his breath and grabbed the edge of the conference table. Do you understand what canceling this deal will do to our stock tomorrow morning? Edward's expression never changed. Better than understanding what federal investigators would do 6 months from now. Silence swallowed the room again. Maya could hear the soft vibration of someone's phone against the polished table surface. Outside, a police siren drifted faintly through the snowy Manhattan streets far below. Then Edward did something nobody expected. He looked directly at Maya and pulled out the empty chair beside the executive team. "Sit down, Miss Carter," he said calmly. The room froze all over. Again, Maya blinked once, unsure she heard him correctly. Daniel stared at Edward like the world had tilted sideways. "You cannot be serious." Edward's blue eyes stayed locked on Maya. "Actually," he said quietly, "she may be the only serious person in this entire room." Maya stood perfectly still beside the conference table, convinced for a moment that Edward Sinclair could not possibly be talking to her. The empty chair beside the executive team looked almost unreal beneath the white ceiling lights, like something placed there for someone else entirely. Around the room, faces shifted between disbelief and discomfort. Nobody reached for their phones anymore. Nobody touched their coffee. Even the heating system humming softly through the vents seemed quieter now. Daniel Mercer stared openly at Edward. "You are putting a temp assistant into a confidential executive discussion?" he asked sharply. Edward did not raise his voice. "I am putting the only person who caught the fraud into the discussion." The words settled heavily across the room. Maya felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had spent years teaching herself not to react when people underestimated her. Not because it did not hurt, but because survival often depended on silence. Slowly, she stepped toward the chair. Her flats clicked softly against the marble floor while every executive in the room watched her cross the distance that had separated her from them all morning. 10 feet earlier, she had been invisible. Now she could feel the weight of every stare pressing against her shoulders. She sat carefully at the edge of the leather chair, tablet resting in her lap. Daniel gave a quiet scoff and looked toward the legal team. "This is absurd." Edward ignored him completely. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "walk us through exactly how you identified the discrepancies." Maya swallowed once and glanced toward the massive financial screen still glowing across the wall. "The revenue growth curves repeat too cleanly," she explained quietly. "Natural market movement almost never mirrors itself quarter to quarter without external stabilization." The chief financial officer nodded slowly now, following her logic on his laptop screen. Maya continued carefully, choosing every word with precision. "The liabilities were delayed into inactive reporting cycles. It makes the acquisition appear profitable in the short term while transferring unresolved losses after the merger closes." Nobody interrupted her this time. Snow continued drifting outside the towering windows while gray winter light stretched across the polished conference table. Maya noticed one older investor quietly removing his glasses to rub his eyes. Another executive slowly loosened his collar like the room had become difficult to breathe in. Edward studied Maya with the same focused expression he had earlier, except now there was something else beneath it. Respect. Uncertain at first. Reluctant, even. But real. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. "Fine," he snapped. "Let us pretend she is correct. That still does not explain how a temporary assistant recognized something our analysts missed." The room tightened again. Maya looked down briefly at her hands resting against the tablet. "I studied predictive analytics before I left school," she answered softly. Daniel smirked immediately. "Left school?" Maya already knew what came next before he even spoke. "So we are restructuring a $12 billion merger based on theories from a college dropout." Silence hit the room hard. The words landed exactly where Daniel intended them to. Maya felt her chest tighten sharply, but she kept her face calm. Years ago, comments like that would have shattered her confidence. But life had already humbled her long before Wall Street ever could. Hospital waiting rooms humbled people. Late rent notices humbled people. Watching your younger brother struggle through sensory overload while insurance companies denied therapy claims humbled people. Edward's expression darkened slightly. "That is enough, Daniel." But Daniel was not finished. "No, Edward, this matters. Credentials matter. Experience matters." Then he looked directly at Maya for the first time without dismissing her entirely. "People like her do not belong in rooms like this." The silence afterward felt colder than the snow outside. Maya lowered her eyes toward the table for one painful second. Then she looked back up calmly and said the one thing nobody in the room expected to hear. Maybe that is why I noticed what all of you missed. The room stayed silent after Maya spoke, but it was no longer the same kind of silence from earlier. Before, the executives had ignored her because they believed she had no value. Now nobody spoke because they were being forced to confront the possibility that the most overlooked person in the room understood the danger better than all of them combined. Daniel Mercer leaned back slowly in his chair, jaw tight beneath the pale conference lights. The confidence he carried all morning had begun cracking around the edges. "This is becoming emotional," he said carefully, trying to steady the room again. "We are letting personal narratives interfere with business decisions." Maya almost smiled at that. Emotional. The word powerful people often used when truth became inconvenient. Outside the glass walls, thick snowflakes drifted through the gray Manhattan afternoon, coating rooftops and traffic lights in white, while the city below continued moving like nothing had changed. Inside the boardroom, everything had changed. Edward Sinclair remained standing near the head of the conference table, one hand resting lightly against the polished marble surface. He looked toward the legal team again. How long would federal auditors need to uncover this after closing? The senior attorney answered quietly. Weeks, maybe days. Nobody missed the meaning behind that answer. Billions in exposure. Shareholder lawsuits. Regulatory investigations. Years of damage. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. This deal was vetted by 3 accounting firms. And still she caught it. The chief financial officer replied without looking up from his screen. That seemed to hit Daniel harder than the financial numbers themselves. Maya stayed silent now, hands folded carefully in her lap beneath the table. Her pulse had finally slowed, but exhaustion settled into her bones like cold rain. She thought about Isaiah sitting in their apartment back in Queens waiting for her text message like he did every afternoon. She pictured the old radiator knocking against the wall beside his video games. The tiny kitchen table covered in insurance forms. Half-empty cereal boxes. Medical receipts stacked beneath unpaid electric bills. None of this felt connected to the billion-dollar room surrounding her, yet somehow every part of her life had led here. Edward suddenly looked toward her again. "Why did you say something?" he asked quietly. The question surprised everyone, including Maya herself. Daniel gave a small scoff. Because she wanted attention. But Edward ignored him completely. Maya hesitated before answering. Because innocent people were about to pay for someone else's dishonesty. The room fell still again. Her voice had not risen once all afternoon. That was what unsettled people most. She was not trying to embarrass anyone, not trying to prove herself superior. She simply refused to stay quiet while people got hurt. Edward studied her face carefully now, like he was seeing details he had overlooked before. The exhaustion beneath her eyes, the worn edge of her tablet case, the calm discipline in the way she carried herself despite being humiliated repeatedly in front of executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He realized something uncomfortable then. Maya had shown more integrity in one afternoon than some men in that room had shown in entire careers. Daniel pushed back his chair suddenly. "I am not sitting here while a temporary assistant dismantles my reputation over accounting interpretations." He grabbed his portfolio from the table with sharp movements. "If Sinclair Global walks away from this acquisition, investors will blame all of us." Edward's expression never shifted. "No," he said quietly. "They will blame the people who manipulated the numbers." Daniel stopped moving. The silence afterwards stretched long and heavy. Then Edward spoke again, softer this time. "And they will remember the person who tried to stop it." Maya lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished table surface because she did not trust herself to speak. For the first time all day, nobody in the room looked at her like she was invisible anymore. Daniel Mercer did. Not leave the boardroom immediately. He stood near the end of the marble table gripping his leather portfolio so tightly that the veins in his hands showed beneath the pale conference lights. Snow continued falling beyond the giant windows, muting the city outside in soft white silence. But inside Sinclair Global the atmosphere had turned sharp and brittle. Nobody trusted the room anymore. Not the numbers. Not the merger. Not even each other. Edward Sinclair slowly returned to his chair at the head of the table, but he did not sit down right away. Instead, he looked toward the information technology analyst still sorting through live reporting files projected across the massive screen. "Open the archived correspondence tied to the delayed liabilities," Edward said quietly. Daniel's head snapped up immediately. That is unnecessary. Edward finally looked at him directly. Do it. The analyst hesitated only a second before obeying. Emails began appearing across the screen one after another, time-stamped over the previous 6 months. Internal approvals, financial adjustments, delayed disclosures. Maya watched the room grow colder with every file opened. The legal director leaned forward slowly, reading line after line with tightening eyes. Then one message appeared larger than the rest. Authorized by D. Mercer. The room stopped breathing. Daniel's face lost color instantly beneath the white conference lights. Edward, listen to me, he said quickly. Those adjustments were temporary restructuring measures. This is being taken completely out of context. But nobody answered him immediately. The evidence no longer looked complicated. It looked intentional. Maya lowered her eyes toward the table again. She did not feel satisfaction watching Daniel unravel in front of the room. Only sadness. Because underneath the expensive suits and executive titles, people were still capable of choosing greed over honesty every single day. Edward finally sat down slowly at the head of the table, fingers interlocked in front of him. You authorized hidden liability transfers before the acquisition closed, he said calmly. Daniel laughed once under his breath, but it sounded hollow. Now, every major company manipulates positioning before mergers. Not like this, the legal director interrupted sharply. This crosses into fraud exposure. The word hung in the room like ice water. Fraud. Nobody moved after that. Outside, a gust of snow swept against the windows high above Manhattan, while the fading afternoon light turned the skyline silver and gray. Maya noticed one investor quietly closing his folder altogether, as though he no longer wanted physical contact with anything tied to the deal. Daniel looked around the room desperately now, searching for support that never came. You are all acting like she exposed some grand conspiracy, he snapped, pointing toward Maya again. She got lucky. Maya stayed silent. Edward did not. No, he said quietly. She paid attention. Daniel scoffed bitterly. You are willing to trust her over executives who have spent decades building this company. Edward's expression remained unreadable for several seconds. Then he answered with the calm certainty of someone finally seeing the truth clearly. The difference is that she had nothing to gain from telling the truth. Silence swallowed the room again. Maya felt something tighten painfully in her chest at those words, because nobody had ever defended her like that before inside spaces built on power. Her entire life, she had learned to shrink herself in professional rooms. Speak carefully. Smile politely. Never make powerful people uncomfortable. Yet somehow the one moment she stopped shrinking had exposed everything hidden beneath the polished surface of the company surrounding her. Edward looked toward the legal team again. Terminate the merger immediately, he ordered. Freeze all outgoing approvals and prepare internal review procedures. The executives nodded quickly now. Nobody argued anymore. Daniel stood motionless beside the table, isolated in a room that had once protected him completely. Then Edward turned back toward Maya one final time. His voice softened slightly. Miss Carter, he said quietly, you just saved this company from destroying itself. The boardroom slowly emptied over the next 20 minutes, but nobody left with the same confidence they carried in earlier that afternoon. Executives gathered folders in silence. Investors avoided eye contact. Lawyers whispered quietly near the windows while emergency review procedures were already being drafted across glowing laptop screens. Outside, the snowfall over Manhattan had grown heavier, covering the streets below in a soft layer of white that reflected against the glass walls like cold light. Maya remained seated near the end of the conference table long after everyone else stood up. Her tablet rested quietly in her lap now, the battery nearly dead. The adrenaline that carried her through the confrontation had faded completely, leaving only exhaustion behind. She still felt out of place sitting in the leather chair beside executives who owned penthouses and private jets while she worried about whether her MetroCard balance would last through Friday. Daniel Mercer finally walked out without another word, shoulders tight beneath his expensive charcoal coat. Nobody stopped him. Nobody defended him. The silence following his exit felt strangely peaceful. Edward Sinclair stood near the windows overlooking the city, one hand in his pocket, watching snow drift between the skyscrapers below. For several moments he said nothing at all. Maya quietly gathered her things, assuming the meeting was over for her too. Temporary assistants did not stay after executive crises ended. They disappeared before people remembered they were still in the room. She had just risen from the chair when Edward spoke without turning around. "Miss Carter." Maya paused immediately. "Yes, sir." Edward faced her slowly now, and for the first time all day his expression no longer carried the hard distance of a chief executive speaking to staff. He looked tired. Human, even. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. The words caught Maya completely off guard. Across the polished conference table, the remaining executives stopped moving almost instantly. Edward Sinclair was not known for apologizing to anyone. "You warned this room before anyone else understood the danger," he continued calmly. "And instead of listening, we questioned whether you even belonged here." Maya lowered her eyes briefly toward the floor. She did not know what to say because people in power rarely admitted when they were wrong, especially to someone beneath them. Edward walked slowly toward the conference table, his shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. "I built my career believing expertise always looked a certain way," he admitted. "Certain schools, certain backgrounds, certain people." His gaze met hers directly now. Today proved how wrong that thinking can be. The room stayed completely silent. Maya tightened her grip around the strap of her worn tablet case. "I was not trying to embarrass anyone," she said softly. "I know," Edward replied immediately. "That is exactly why your voice mattered." Snow brushed gently against the giant windows behind him while the last gray daylight faded across the skyline. Maya suddenly thought about her mother again, about those exhausting double shifts behind grocery registers, about all the mornings she left for school before sunrise because surviving mattered more than resting. People like her mother spent entire lives unseen by rooms like this. Yet somehow everything her mother taught her about dignity, discipline, and honesty had carried Maya here at the exact moment this company needed someone willing to speak. Edward reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a slim white business card. He placed it carefully on the conference table between them. "Sinclair Global has an internal strategic analytics division," he said calmly. "Tomorrow morning, I would like you to meet with them." Maya blinked once, genuinely stunned. "Sir, I am not even finished with school." Edward gave the faintest hint of a smile. Neither was Steve Jobs. A few quiet laughs escaped from the remaining executives, soft and nervous, but Maya could not laugh yet. Her throat tightened too quickly. Edward's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "You saw what everyone else missed," he said quietly. "Not because you were louder, because you were paying attention." Maya looked down at the business card resting beneath the pale conference lights. For the first time in years, the future in front of her no longer looked closed. The next morning, Manhattan looked softer beneath fresh snow. Yellow taxis moved slowly through wet streets while steam curled upward from subway grates into the pale winter air. Maya Carter stood across from Sinclair Global Tower, holding a paper cup of coffee between both hands, staring up at the glass building that had almost swallowed her whole the day before. The business card Edward Sinclair gave her rested carefully inside her coat pocket, slightly bent at the corners from how many times she checked to make sure it was real. Strategic Analytics Division. 9th floor. 9 simple words that felt impossible beside the reality she came from. Her phone buzzed softly. "Isaiah." She answered immediately. "Did you eat breakfast?" she asked. "Yes," her younger brother replied quietly through the speaker. "You sound nervous." Maya smiled faintly despite herself. "I am." There was a small pause before Isaiah spoke again. "Mom would say nervous means something important is happening." Maya looked down at the sidewalk covered in melting snow and swallowed carefully. Some mornings grief still arrived unexpectedly, soft and sharp all at once. "Yeah," she whispered. She probably would. By 8:30 she stepped into the Sinclair lobby again, but this time everything felt different. The marble floors still gleamed beneath crystal lighting. Executives still crossed the lobby in expensive coats carrying polished briefcases. Yet the security guard who barely glanced at her yesterday now stood a little straighter when she approached. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said politely. Maya blinked once before quietly returning the greeting. Invisible people notice when the world suddenly sees them. Upstairs, the 9th floor carried none of the intimidating silence of the executive boardroom. Analysts moved between glowing monitors covered in charts, projections, and market models while quiet conversations drifted through the open workspace. A woman in a charcoal sweater approached Maya with a warm smile. "You must be Maya. I am Rebecca from Analytics Onboarding." No suspicion in her voice. No condescension. Just respect. Maya followed her through rows of desks, trying not to look overwhelmed by the massive digital displays covering the walls. Predictive forecasting models, risk assessment dashboards, real-time market simulations. It felt strangely familiar, like stepping back into a version of herself she thought life had erased years ago. Rebecca stopped beside a desk overlooking the snowy Manhattan skyline.